There comes a moment in every empath's life when the body begins to whisper what the soul has been trying to say for years. It starts as exhaustion, a weariness that sleep can't touch. You wake with the feeling that the world has been feeding on you, that every conversation takes more than it gives. And one morning, you realize you've been living your life as an emotional buffet. Everyone eats, but you're left starving. This is where Jung began his work with those he called the givers of the world, people whose compassion had become a disguise for self-erasure. He saw in them not weakness, but a sacred misunderstanding, the belief that love means abandoning oneself. My dear, have you ever felt that the more you gave, the less you existed? Elizabeth felt it too. For 15 years, she absorbed the storms of others. Her sister's endless heartbreak, her mother's guilt, her husband's quiet disappointment. She was the sun for everyone else, but her own warmth was fading. Then one day, her body collapsed. Chronic fatigue, migraines, panic attacks that came like ghosts in the night. Doctors found nothing wrong, but Jung saw the truth. He told her softly, "Your psyche is rebelling. You've mistaken compassion for surrender." He gave her a single task. Say no once this week. Just once. It sounded small, but for someone who had built her identity around being needed, it was like asking her to breathe underwater. That evening, her sister called, ready, as always, to pour her unhappiness into Elizabeth's open heart. But this time Elizabeth said, "I love you, but I can't talk tonight. I need rest." The silence on the other end was sharp. Then came the words that pierce every empath's soul. "You've changed. You used to care." Within days, the backlash began. Her mother called, worried. Her husband grew distant. Friends stopped inviting her out. And Elizabeth returned to Jung in tears. "I said one no," she whispered, "and I'm losing everyone." Jung smiled, not cruelly but knowingly. "You're not losing everyone," he said. "You're discovering who is never truly with you." That moment, that single sentence, was the beginning of her rebirth. Because when an empath finally chooses peace, the world that was built on their self-abandonment begins to crumble. This is the first gate of individuation. It feels like collapse, but it's actually awakening. You're not falling apart. You're falling back into yourself. When you first say no, you break the invisible contract that has governed so many of your relationships. A contract you never signed, but one you honored with every overextension, every late-night rescue, every swallowed truth. "I will be endlessly available," the contract says, "and in return, I will be loved." But love bought through self-erasure is not love. It is dependency in disguise. So when you set a boundary, the system panics. Your no exposes what was hidden all along, and those who benefited from your compliance will call it betrayal. That, my friend, is what Jung called the boundary crisis, the sacred chaos that begins every true transformation. It hurts, because your nervous system interprets rejection as danger. Research would later confirm what Jung sensed intuitively, that social exclusion lights up the same regions in the brain as physical pain. So when people pull away, it doesn't just feel emotional. It feels existential. But pain isn't always a sign of harm. Sometimes it's the body's way of saying, you are leaving captivity. In that loneliness, you meet yourself for the first time. And for a moment, it feels unbearable, because the silence left behind by those who once consumed you echoes louder than any voice you've ever heard. Yet that silence, that terrifying emptiness, is not abandonment. It is space. Space where your own voice can finally be heard. So if you find yourself in that place now, where everything familiar is dissolving, where you're being called selfish for saving your own life, know this: you are not losing everyone. You are losing the illusion that you were ever loved for who you are. You are being reborn as someone who no longer confuses exhaustion with compassion. Take a breath. Feel the ground beneath you. This is the threshold, the part of the journey where everything false must fall away, so that what is true can finally stand. And though your heart may ache from the exodus, what is leaving was never yours to keep. This, my dear friend, is only the beginning. Because after the boundary crisis, comes the revelation. The moment when you begin to see not just who left, but what patterns have been guiding your entire emotional life. And that is where our story deepens. When the first wave of loss passes, a quieter truth begins to rise. You start to see that every relationship was built on unspoken agreements. Not malicious, not even conscious, just inherited blueprints of survival. Jung called them invisible contracts of belonging. They form in childhood, when love feels conditional and approval becomes oxygen. You learn that to be safe, you must please. To be seen, you must serve. And to keep peace, you must disappear. In the house where you first learned love, perhaps anger was dangerous, honesty unwelcome. So you learned to smile instead of speak. You became harmony in human form. And the world rewarded you, not for being whole, but for being useful. Years later, those invisible contracts still whisper in your ear. Stay small, stay soft, stay needed. You confuse intensity with intimacy, guilt with responsibility, rescue with love. You begin to believe that the only way to be worthy is to be wanted. But my friend, need is not the same as love. Need can imprison just as easily as it connects. And the empath's tragedy is that they often mistake one for the other. Elizabeth's story mirrors our own. After her first boundary, she began to see the pattern everywhere. Her sister's nightly calls were not acts of closeness, they were transactions. Her mother's guilt was a currency. Her husband's quiet sighs were reminders that her comfort had always been conditional. "You've changed," meant you've stopped feeding me. This revelation hurt more than the rejection itself, because it forced her to confront an unbearable question. Had she ever truly been loved? Jung told her gently, "You were loved for what you provided, not for who you are. And now you are asking to be loved without performance." That is the price of awakening. To face that many of your relationships were not mutual exchanges of soul, but subtle economies of need. He compared it to alchemy, the old self dissolving in the fire of truth. In that furnace, illusion burns first. Then, if you endure, gold begins to appear. The gold is authenticity, but the fire must come first. During this phase, the psyche becomes hypersensitive. You see manipulation where you once saw love. You hear obligation hidden inside compliments. It's easy to become cynical, to see everyone as a taker. But Jung warned, don't turn your insight into a weapon. The goal is not to judge others, but to see clearly how you participated in your own depletion. Because every empath secretly believes they are selfless. But selflessness, when born from fear, is not virtue. It's a survival strategy. You learn to give because giving kept you safe. You learn to overfunction because it distracted from your own pain. You became the caretaker because no one else was coming. And when that pattern finally cracks, you meet the part of yourself you've avoided the most. The one who also has needs. She's been waiting a long time. At first, she feels like a stranger, a child locked in a room you forgot existed. She doesn't speak in words. She speaks in fatigue, in resentment, in the quiet ache beneath your smile. If you listen, she'll tell you what she's always wanted. Rest, safety, to be considered, to be chosen by you. This is the descent Jung spoke of, the catabasis, the journey into the underworld of the soul. You must meet your shadow, the part that says, "I give because I fear being forgotten." Don't shame her. Hold her, because that is the part that needs love the most. As Elizabeth began to honor her own limits, something unexpected happened. The people who once relied on her began to panic. Her sister escalated, showing up unannounced. Her mother organized a family meeting. Her husband created crises that demanded attention. Jung explained, they're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to restore equilibrium. Systems resist change. In codependent families, one person's awakening threatens the illusion that everyone else depends on. When you become whole, you mirror others' fragmentation, and mirrors are rarely welcomed. This is why boundary work feels like war, because every no you speak is heard by the unconscious as revolution, and revolutions are lonely. Yet within that loneliness lies sacred information. Each reaction you face becomes a teacher. Anger shows you where guilt once ruled. Silence shows you where noise once hid truth. Distance shows you where false closeness once thrived. Every withdrawal, every accusation, every sigh of disappointment, they are not evidence that you are wrong. They are proof that you are changing the pattern. And slowly, beneath the chaos, a deeper stillness begins to emerge. You start to feel it between the arguments, in the space after you say no and before they respond. It is the sound of you returning home, but the psyche is cunning. Just when you begin to trust this stillness, it sends you the next test, the temptation to collapse, because part of you still believes that peace is found in being needed. And when the calls stop coming, when no one asks for your help, that part panics. If I'm not fixing, who am I? That is the question that divides the wounded empath from the emerging self. Who are you when you are not saving anyone? Jung said that until you answer that, you will unconsciously recreate chaos just to feel relevant. So Elizabeth learned a sacred practice. When the urge to rescue arose, she paused and asked, "Am I helping because I choose to, or because I'm afraid not to?" If it was fear, she stayed still. If it was choice, she moved. In that simple discernment, her entire life began to shift. This is the deep dive, the discovery that true compassion begins where compulsion ends. It is love without rescue, presence without depletion, empathy without erasure. And though the world may not yet understand this version of you, your soul does. You are learning the rare art of conscious love, a love that includes yourself. Soon, however, this new awareness will meet its fiercest test, because when you stop abandoning yourself, others will begin to test how serious you are. They will try to pull you back into the old dance, to see if the new you is real or just a phase. That, my dear, is where the story turns from awakening to endurance. Every transformation has a price. When you begin to live as your true self, the world responds like a nervous system exposed to light. It twitches, contracts, resists, because authenticity disrupts every system built on your silence. For Elizabeth, the weeks after her first boundary felt like standing in the ruins of a familiar city. The phone barely rang. The house felt too quiet, and the part of her that had once lived for other people began to panic. She sat across from Jung, hands trembling. "Everyone is gone," she said. Her voice was small, as though she were confessing a crime. "I wanted to be free, but now I feel abandoned." Jung looked at her with eyes both stern and kind. "Your life is rearranging itself to match your truth," he said. "Those who loved your mask will fade. Those who can meet your soul will find you. But in between, there is the valley of solitude. The valley, that desolate stretch between who you were and who you're becoming, is where every empath meets their testing. It is not punishment, it is purification. During this phase, life will tempt you to return to your old patterns. Your family might create crises. Old friends may reach out, suddenly in need again. And within you, the rescuer stirs. That part who feels guilty for choosing peace. This is where the real work begins. Because the first boundary is an act of courage. But the second, the third, the 10th, those are acts of devotion. They are the rituals through which your nervous system learns safety without servitude. Elizabeth's sister began appearing at her doorstep unannounced. Her mother organized a family dinner that turned into an intervention. Her husband scheduled important events during her rest days, then accused her of being distant when she declined. Each moment was a test. Would she collapse back into compliance? Or could she stand inside her truth, calm and grounded, even as others spun around her? Jung called this phase the crucible of differentiation, because it burns away every illusion of control. You cannot make others understand your healing. You can only live it, and in that surrender lies your strength. One night, after another argument with her husband, Elizabeth felt the old urge rise, the urge to apologize for existing. She nearly spoke the familiar words, "I'm sorry, I'll do better." But then she caught her reflection in the darkened window. Her own eyes stopped her. She saw the woman who had carried everyone else's pain for years. and something in her snapped. No more. The next morning, she spoke softly, not as a threat, but as a declaration. I love you, but I will not abandon myself to keep this peace. That sentence changed everything. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't end her marriage, but it began a new vibration in her life. A vibration of truth that would attract only what resonated with it. This is the paradox of boundaries. They don't push love away. They filter out everything that isn't love. But the filtering process is painful because it means losing people who once defined your sense of belonging. My friend, if you are here, if people are calling you selfish, if silence has replaced your old chaos, you're in the testing. It's okay to cry. It's okay to doubt. Even the strongest souls tremble when they first choose themselves. But do not mistake the tremble for a sign you're wrong. It is simply your body recalibrating to the frequency of self-respect. The testing reveals something deeper still, patterns that have followed you through every chapter of your life. They show up in new faces but speak the same lines. You've changed. You're too much. You used to be so kind. Each voice is the echo of the same unconscious agreement. Shrink so I can stay comfortable. You will hear these echoes everywhere until you learn the sacred response. I will no longer make myself small for love. In that moment, the contract dissolves, and with it, a lifetime of servitude begins to unravel. But beware, the testing doesn't only come from others. It also comes from within. The mind, terrified of change, will try to recreate the familiar pain. It will whisper, "You're alone. You've made a mistake. Go back." That voice isn't truth. It's conditioning. It's the echo of every time you equated rejection with danger. When that voice speaks, don't fight it. Breathe. Whisper back, "I am safe. I am allowed to rest." With repetition, the nervous system begins to trust the new rhythm, and that trust becomes the foundation of freedom. Over time, Elizabeth's defiance softened into quiet strength. Her no stopped sounding like rebellion and started sounding like self-respect. Her energy began to change, and as it did, new kinds of people began to appear. But before the new can fully arrive, the old must complete its cycle. Her sister, unable to accept the change, sent one final letter. "You're not the sister I knew. You become cold." Elizabeth wept, not because the words were true, but because they marked the end of a chapter. The sister she'd always been was gone, and in her place stood someone both gentler and stronger. This, too, is part of the testing. Mourning the version of yourself that once made everyone comfortable. The world will call it selfish, but the soul calls it maturity. Because to truly love, you must first be. And to be, you must first stop disappearing. Still, not everyone survives this stage without detouring. Some, exhausted by misunderstanding, swing too far in the other direction. They shut the world out completely, mistaking isolation for liberation. Jung warned of this, the trap of spiritual arrogance, the illusion that no one can meet me at my level. That, my friend, is not freedom. It is fear in sacred disguise. The testing is meant to lead you to balance, not separation. But before we reach that wisdom, we must explore what happens when the pendulum swings too far. When self-protection hardens into walls, and solitude becomes a throne of superiority. Because even the awakened can lose their way if they mistake boundaries for barricades. The testing passes, and for a while, all that remains is quiet. At first, that quiet feels sacred, a temple built from solitude. You breathe easier without the weight of other people's storms. You wake without dread, and for the first time in years, your body feels like home. But then, slowly, something begins to shift. The silence that once felt like peace begins to echo. The stillness becomes a cage, and you start to wonder, am I healed or am I hiding? This is the moment when the ego, disguised as enlightenment, tries to take the throne. It whispers, "No one can meet me now. I've outgrown them all." It speaks with the voice of pride. But beneath that pride is fear. The fear of being hurt again. This is where many wanderers lose their way. They trade codependence for isolation, believing they have ascended, when in truth, they've just built higher walls. Jung saw this too. He once worked with a man named Heinrich, who, after setting boundaries with his toxic family, mistook withdrawal for awakening. When Heinrich returned to Jung a year later, he spoke with conviction. "I've removed all toxic people from my life. I am finally at peace." Jung asked gently, "And who remains?" Heinrich smiled. "Myself. That's all I need." But there was a tremor beneath his words. Jung leaned forward and said softly, "Peace that excludes life is not peace. It is avoidance. You see, my friend, isolation wears many masks. It can look like clarity. It can sound like wisdom. But often, it is just fear wearing spiritual clothing. When you have spent years overgiving, solitude feels intoxicating, like water to a soul that has only known drought. But the goal of individuation is not to become separate. It is to become separable, whole enough to choose connection without losing yourself. The hermit stage is necessary, but it is not the destination. If you stay there too long, your empathy hardens into judgment. You begin to see others as unconscious, low vibration, too needy. You use awareness as armor. You mistake superiority for safety. And slowly, your own shadow begins to grow again, this time cloaked in a language of healing. Elizabeth felt this too. Months after her boundary awakening, she found herself avoiding not only her family, but everyone, her co-workers, her friends, even her therapist. She called it protecting her energy, but truthfully she was afraid. Afraid that if she re-entered the world, she would lose herself again. So Jung gave her a new task. "Go to the park," he said. "Sit near people. Don't speak. Just feel." It sounded simple, almost childish. But when she tried, her heart raced. Every sound, laughter, conversation, footsteps, felt intrusive. Still, she returned, day after day, until one morning, she saw a little boy offering crumbs to a bird. The bird landed near his hand, and for a brief moment, the boy's face filled with pure wonder. Elizabeth felt something stir inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in months. It was not obligation. It was connection. Tears filled her eyes, because she realized she missed this. Not the chaos of overgiving, but the tenderness of being part of life. That moment was her turning point. She told Jung, "I thought I was free, but I was just alone." He smiled. "Then your healing is beginning to deepen. You are ready to move from protection to participation." This is where individuation matures, when the boundaries that once felt like walls become bridges. To reach this stage, the soul must learn 3 lessons. First, that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the willingness to be seen without collapsing. You can say, "I need help," and still remain whole. Second, that empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice. You can care deeply and still keep your center. The key is presence without absorption. Feeling with, not feeling instead of. And third, that connection doesn't threaten freedom. The more you honor your own edges, the more you can safely touch another soul. When Elizabeth began to practice these truths, her world slowly reopened. She attended a local support group, not as a rescuer, but as an equal. There, she met someone named Marie. From the start, it felt different. Marie didn't demand emotional labor. She asked questions and listened, not to fix, but to understand. Their friendship grew quietly, like 2 trees whose roots intertwined beneath the soil. When they met for coffee, Marie would sometimes say, "I can only stay an hour. I have therapy after." And instead of feeling rejected, Elizabeth felt relief. An hour felt perfect. It was enough. For the first time, she experienced relationship without exhaustion. It was simple, human, reciprocal. Jung called this the return. It is the phase when the soul re-enters life, but as something entirely new, no longer driven by need, but guided by wholeness. The paradox is that when you no longer need others to complete you, you finally become capable of genuine intimacy, because you are not coming to take, you're coming to share. This is where real connection lives, not in endless giving or proud withdrawal, but in the quiet middle, where 2 complete souls meet, not to rescue, not to merge, but simply to witness each other's being. That is love without bondage, presence without consumption, freedom with tenderness. Elizabeth began to build a small circle of such souls. People who valued depth over drama, truth over pretense. They were not perfect, but they were real. And that reality healed her more than solitude ever could. Still, Jung warned her, the journey doesn't end when you find peace. It ends when you learn to maintain it. Because even after awakening, the old patterns whisper. The rescuer waits at the edges of every new connection, ready to reclaim its throne. The task now is vigilance, to hold your wholeness gently, and to stay flexible without losing form. Integration is not a static state. It is a living rhythm, a dance between autonomy and belonging, between self and soul, between the sacred I and the divine we. When you reach this understanding, life ceases to feel like survival. It becomes participation, an exchange between your inner world and the outer one. The sun rises again, not as a spotlight demanding performance, but as warmth that invites growth. You begin to see that peace was never about distance. It was about alignment. And when you live in alignment, boundaries no longer separate. They define the shape of your love. But every rhythm needs grounding. Even the awakened must remember to return to the body, to the simple practices that keep the soul anchored in the human experience. That, my friend, is where the final chapter unfolds. The integration of everything learned, the synthesis of solitude and connection, and the quiet power of a life lived whole. Morning light fills the room. It is gentle now, not blinding, not demanding, just enough to remind you that you're alive. Elizabeth sits by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The garden outside hums with quiet movement, bees, wind, distant laughter. She no longer flinches at the sound of life. It enters and leaves her like breath. This is what integration feels like. Not fireworks, not victory, but balance. The steady hum of a soul in rhythm with itself. She journals every morning, not to fix herself, but to stay conscious. Each page begins with the same question. Is this decision honoring me? That question has become her compass. She works less, but creates more. Speaks less, but means more. Loves fewer people, but deeper. And when the old guilt creeps in, the whisper that says she should do more, give more, be more, she smiles, because she recognizes that voice now. It's the ghost of a contract that no longer binds her. Jung once told her, the goal of individuation is not to become separate, but to become separable, to know where you end and another begins, and to bridge that space consciously. That is the essence of maturity. Connection without captivity. For many, this is the first time love feels peaceful. It no longer roars or consumes. It simply is, like the tide, steady, certain, inevitable. Elizabeth and Marie still meet for coffee. Sometimes they talk for hours, sometimes just a few minutes. Sometimes they sit in silence, watching the world move around them. The friendship doesn't demand. It allows. When one is struggling, the other listens. When one is thriving, the other celebrates. There is no scorekeeping, no silent resentment. Just two souls witnessing each other's evolution. This is the new form of belonging. Reciprocal, conscious, alive. You see, real connection begins only when you no longer fear disconnection. Because when you trust your own wholeness, you can let others come and go without losing yourself. That is freedom, not the absence of attachment, but the presence of grounded love. And from that place, new kinds of relationships emerge. Partnerships built not on need, but on resonance. Friendships that honor your solitude as much as your togetherness. Communities where empathy flows in both directions. Elizabeth learned to perform what she called the boundary audit, a simple practice of awareness. Once a month, she would sit quietly and ask, does this relationship respect my boundaries? Do I feel energized or drained after our connection? Is there reciprocity over time? If the answers were unclear, she didn't panic. She adjusted, because boundaries, like seasons, shift. They breathe. They evolve. They are not walls. They're living agreements between your soul and the world. And when those agreements are honored, life becomes lighter. She still visits her mother, now on her own terms. Her mother doesn't fully understand, but she no longer argues. They laugh more. The visits are shorter, but warmer. Her husband, once distant, has softened. He went to therapy, faced his own wounds. Their marriage is no longer a rescue mission. It's a collaboration. Two people, each with their own light, learning how to shine side by side without dimming the other. As for her sister, silence remains, but is no longer a wound. It is simply truth, and truth, when accepted, stops hurting. One evening, Elizabeth told Jung, "I feel alone sometimes, but not lonely." He nodded. That's how you know you're whole. Aloneness is the companion of the individuated soul. It walks beside you, but it no longer frightens you. He leaned back and smiled, the kind of smile that carries decades of knowing. You've discovered what I spent my life trying to describe. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The rest of the world will rarely celebrate your wholeness. It prefers the version of you that plays by its rules. So you must become your own witness, your own mirror. Celebrate the quiet victories. The moment you said no without explanation. The day you rested without guilt. The conversation where you spoke your truth and didn't shrink. Each one is a thread in the tapestry of your becoming. This is the real revolution. Not loud, not dramatic, but sacred and steady. You are shifting the lineage of self-abandonment, ending centuries of inherited silence. You are proving that love and boundaries can coexist. That compassion need not equal depletion. That you can be soft and still say no. And that, my friend, changes everything. So here you are, not broken, not perfect, but whole. You can sit in solitude without drowning. You can open your heart without vanishing. You can care deeply without carrying what isn't yours. This is what it means to live integrated, to move through the world as both ocean and shore, soft yet defined, infinite yet contained. When people ask you what changed, you won't have an easy answer. You just smile and say, "I remember myself," because that's all healing ever is. A homecoming. And now, if you're standing where Elizabeth once stood, on the edge of your own boundary awakening, remember this: you are not losing everyone. You are discovering who can meet you whole. The pain is real, but it's labor pain. Something new is being born. The loneliness is temporary, but the relationships you're building now are permanent because they're based on truth, not pretense. Let what needs to leave, leave. Let what needs to stay, stay. And trust that the ones meant for your next chapter are already walking toward you, drawn by the sound of your wholeness. Take one last breath, my dear. Feel the quiet hum of your own presence. That's you, the self that no longer trades authenticity for approval. You didn't survive just to stay safe. You survived to be free, to love consciously, to live as proof that empathy and self-respect can share the same heart. So go live gently but firmly. Speak softly but with truth. Rest often. And remember, you are allowed to be both, a sanctuary for others and a home for yourself. Because when you are whole, you don't just change your life, you change what love means. And that, my friend, is the true beginning.